Ready for a real mind bender? Today, we're diving deep into the world of thin slicing.
Thin slicing.
Yeah, it's how our brains make those crazy fast
Oh,
judgments.
like snap decisions.
Exactly. And sometimes they're shockingly accurate, even with just a tiny bit of information.
You mean like we're judging books by their covers?
Kinda, but it's more than that. It's like our brains are doing these Sherlock Holmes
Hold
deductions.
on, Sherlock
You know
Holmes.
those lightning fast deductions, but we don't even realize it's happening? And here's the kicker, we often can't explain how we get to these conclusions.
So it's like our gut is talking, but we don't know why.
Totally. Like when you meet someone new and instantly get a good or bad vibe.
Oh, I know that feeling. But you're saying there's actual science behind this.
Oh, yeah. This isn't just some mystical intuition thing. There's a whole science to it.
Okay, now you've got me intrigued. So how can our brains be so accurate so quickly with barely any information?
Well, it all comes down to something called heuristics.
Heuristics.
Yeah.
Sounds
Yeah.
complicated.
Not really. They're basically mental shortcuts, like pre-programmed algorithms in our brains.
Algorithms. You're losing me.
Okay, imagine this. Your brain doesn't have time to analyze every single detail when you're making a decision, right?
Right, because who has time for that?
Exactly. So it uses these heuristics, these shortcuts, to quickly filter the information and guide your judgment.
So it's like instead of reading the whole book, our brain just skims the highlights.
Exactly. And the amazing part is these shortcuts are often based on deep-seated patterns and associations that we've learned from experience.
Even if we don't even realize it.
Exactly. Like, let's say you had a bad experience with a certain type of dog when you were younger.
Okay, I'm following.
Your brain might automatically link that breed with danger, even if every other dog of that breed you meet is totally friendly.
So it's like our brain is playing connect the dots with our past experiences.
Precisely. Our brains are constantly making these connections, linking what we experience with what we feel, creating these mental shortcuts.
And those shortcuts shape how we see the world.
You got it. Which brings us back to those gut feelings.
So you're saying our gut is actually this supercomputer making lightning fast calculations.
That's a great way to put it. And sometimes those gut instincts, those split-second judgments can be incredibly accurate.
Like scarily accurate.
Think about those marriage experts who can predict if a couple will split up just by watching them for a few minutes.
Wait, seriously? Just a few minutes? How's that even possible?
It's all about recognizing those subtle cues, those tiny behaviors that reveal a lot about their relationship.
So it's not just what they're saying, but how they're saying it.
Bingo! Their tone of voice, body language, even those fleeting micro-expressions that betray their true feelings.
Micro expressions. Okay, now you're just using big words. What are those?
Okay, imagine this. You're trying to hide your annoyance with your friend, but for a split second, a flash of irritation flickers across your face.
Oh, I've totally done that.
That, my friend, is a micro-expression. They're these tiny leaks of emotion gone in a flash that our faces can't help but reveal even when we're trying to keep a poker face.
So our faces are basically betraying us, even when we're trying our hardest to hide what we're really thinking.
You got it.
That's kind of freaky, but also super fascinating. But these micro expressions, they happen so fast, right? Can anyone even spot them?
You're right, most people don't even notice them. But trained experts, they've learned to pick up on these cues, and they can be incredibly revealing.
Okay, that makes sense for, like, therapists or something, people who are trained to spot those things. But what about us regular folks? Just going about our day.
That's where it gets really interesting because even without any special training, our brains are constantly making these snap judgments, often based on the smallest things.
Okay, I need an example. Give me an example.
All right, picture this. Art experts standing in a museum looking at what's supposed to be an ancient Greek statue.
Okay, I'm picturing...
These experts, they take one look at the statue and instantly know something's off. They can just tell.
Wait, really? Was the statue, like, glowing or something?
Yeah.
How could they tell just by looking?
It wasn't anything that obvious. It was more of a feeling, a sense that something wasn't right.
Like a sixth sense?
Kind of. They couldn't quite put their finger on it at first, but their gut, their intuition, it was screaming fake.
So their brains were picking up on these super subtle clues that most of us would totally miss.
Exactly. Like those tells in poker that give away a bluff. Their brains had built up this huge mental database of what authentic Greek statues look like, and this one just didn't match up.
Wow, it's wild. It's like they have this secret language of intuition that only they understand.
Exactly. And even though they couldn't consciously explain those inconsistencies right away, their unconscious minds knew something was up.
This is blowing my mind.
Yeah.
But it also makes you wonder, if our brains are capable of all this incredible detective work, what else are we picking up on without even realizing it?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it leads us to an even more intriguing aspect of thin slicing. How it shapes the way we interact with other people, even in those everyday, seemingly ordinary
Okay, now
encounters.
you're really making me think.
Mm.
So how does this thin slicing thing play out in our relationships, our careers, those everyday interactions? You've got me hooked. I need to know more.
So we're secretly judging ancient statues, decoding microexpressions, even predicting divorces, all without even realizing it. Our brains are like undercover detectives working behind the scenes.
I like that analogy,
Mhm.
but it does make you wonder, what happens when our inner detective gets it wrong?
Right, because let's be real, we've all had those moments where our gut feeling totally led us astray.
Totally. And sometimes those misjudgments, they can have real consequences.
Absolutely. And it makes you think about those times we've judged someone based solely on first impressions.
Oh, 100%. Like we've all done it, right?
Yeah,
Made assumptions about someone just based on how they look.
exactly. It's like that saying, you never get a second chance to make a first impression.
So true. Our brains are hardwired to categorize and label, often based on just a few superficial details.
And those initial impressions can be tough to shake, even when they're based on, like, faulty logic or unconscious biases.
Exactly. Malcolm Gladwell calls this the Warren Harding error.
Warren Harding error. Okay, now I have to refresh my memory. Who is Warren Harding again?
So he was a U.S. president, and honestly, not a very good one.
Right, I think I'm remembering now.
But here's the thing. Warren Harding, he looked the part, you know,
Mm.
tall, handsome, had that commanding presence.
Ah, so people were swayed by his appearance. They saw what they wanted to see, not who he really was.
Exactly. People thin-sliced him, made assumptions about his leadership qualities based purely on how he looked.
And that's why it's called the Warren Harding error. We let those snap judgments, influenced by our biases, cloud our judgment.
Bingo. And it's not just about physical appearance either. Our unconscious biases, they can be based on all sorts of things.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Oh, you name it. Race, gender, age, even how someone dresses or speaks. These biases can creep into our judgments without us even realizing it.
That's a bit unsettling, isn't it? To think that even when we believe we're being objective, our unconscious biases might be calling the shots.
It's true. Our brains, they're constantly filtering information through the lens of our past experiences, our upbringing, all of it.
So, are we destined to be ruled by these unconscious biases? Is there any way to, like, rewire our brains to be more objective?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And the good news is it is possible to challenge and overcome those biases. It takes effort, but it's definitely doable.
Okay, so how do we do it? What are some strategies for, like, debiasing our brains?
Well, one powerful example is what happened when orchestras started using blind auditions.
Blind auditions. You mean the musicians play behind a screen so the judges can't see them?
You got it. For years, orchestras were overwhelmingly dominated by men.
Really? Why was that?
Well, conductors often unconsciously just assumed that women weren't as capable of playing certain instruments.
Wow, that's just, wow.
It's a classic example of unconscious bias at work. But when orchestras introduced those blind auditions where the musician's gender was hidden, something amazing happened.
What happened?
More women started getting hired. By removing that visual cue, those unconscious biases, they were able to evaluate the musicians purely on their musical talent.
That's incredible. So, by creating that blind spot for prejudice, they leveled the playing field.
Exactly. And it shows that with a little creative problem solving, we can create systems that promote fairness and help us overcome those deeply ingrained biases.
I love that. It gives me hope that we can actually change these patterns, even if it takes some out-of-the-box thinking.
Absolutely. And it's not just about changing the systems around us, it's about changing our own thinking too.
So how do we do that? How do we become more aware of our own biases?
It all starts with mindfulness, paying attention to those gut feelings, both the positive and the negative ones. The next time you have a strong intuitive reaction to something or someone, hit the pause button for a second.
Hit the pause button. Yeah, like take a moment to really examine that feeling. Ask yourself, what's driving this? Is this based on solid evidence, or am I letting my biases color my perception?
So we need to become like investigators of our own minds, questioning those knee-jerk reactions, especially when it comes to other people.
Exactly. We've talked about the dangers of unconscious bias. So if you catch yourself making a snap judgment about someone, challenge yourself to look for evidence that might contradict that initial impression.
It's like we're creating those blind auditions for our own brains, trying to remove those irrelevant factors and focus on what truly matters.
Precisely. And the more we practice this mindful observation, the more attuned we become to those unconscious biases, and the better equipped we are to make those intuitive leaps with greater accuracy and fairness.
So you're saying we can train our intuition like it's a muscle that gets stronger with the right kind of workout.
Exactly. Just like any skill, you can hone your intuition with practice and the right kind of training.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we level up our intuition game? Well, think about those expert food tasters we talked about earlier. The ones who can identify flavors most of us wouldn't even know existed.
You mean those folks who can, like, sniff a glass of wine and tell you exactly where the grapes were grown?
Exactly. It's not magic, it's training.
Mm.
They've trained their brains to recognize subtle patterns and make connections that most of us miss.
So it's like they've developed this superhuman sense of taste.
Not quite superhuman, but they've definitely built up an incredible mental database of flavors and aromas through years of focused practice.
So they're not just like born with this ability, they've actually worked at it.
Exactly. They're actively engaging with those flavors,
Mm.
analyzing them, connecting them to specific regions, grape varieties, even winemaking techniques.
It's like their brains have become these finely tuned instruments, picking up on nuances that most of us would totally miss.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And the exciting thing is, this kind of expertise isn't limited to just, say, sommeliers or perfumers.
So you're saying we can develop this kind of intuitive expertise in other areas of our lives too?
Absolutely. Think about firefighters, for example. They often have to make split-second life-or-death decisions in high-pressure situations.
And their intuition plays a big role in those moments.
Huge. They talk about a sixth sense that some firefighters develop where they can just feel if a building is about to collapse.
Wow, that's incredible. But you're saying that's not some mystical power, it's actually their brains rapidly processing information.
Precisely. Their brains are constantly scanning for subtle cues, the way smoke is moving, the sounds the building is making, and comparing those cues to their vast database of past experiences.
It's like their intuition is giving them a heads up even before they can consciously process the danger.
Exactly. And that kind of intuitive expertise can be the difference between life and death.
That's amazing. So for those of us who aren't firefighters or food critics, what are some practical things we can do to cultivate that kind of intuitive wisdom in our own lives?
Well, it starts with becoming more mindful of those gut feelings, both the positive and the negative ones. Don't just brush them off.
So next time I have a hunch, I shouldn't ignore it.
Not necessarily, but take a moment to examine it. Ask yourself, what's fueling this feeling? Is it based on something concrete, or am I letting my biases lead the way?
So it's about like hitting the pause button on autopilot and really tuning in to what our intuition is trying to tell us.
Exactly. And remember those unconscious biases we discussed. If you find yourself jumping to conclusions about someone, challenge yourself to look for evidence that might contradict that initial impression.
It's like we need to be the devil's advocate of our own minds, always questioning, always seeking a more balanced perspective.
Exactly. And the more we practice this kind of mindful self-reflection, the better we become at deciphering those gut feelings and making decisions that are aligned with our values and our best interests.
This has been an incredible journey into the fascinating world of thin slicing and intuition.
It really has.
We've explored how our brains make those lightning-fast judgments, the potential pitfalls of unconscious bias, and the powerful ways we can train our intuition to be more accurate and effective.
And hopefully, we've inspired our listeners to become more aware of their own thin slicing moments, to question those snap judgments, and to harness the incredible power of intuition in their own lives.
It's been a pleasure diving deep into this topic with you today. For our listeners, be sure to check out the show notes for links to Malcolm Gladwell's work and other resources on thin slicing. And until next time, keep those minds curious and those intuitions sharp.